At Oasis Digital, you want to announce around the horn here or introduce?
I'm Paul Spears.
Chris Harden.
Lance Finney.
And everybody here is an absolute expert developer at Oasis Digital. For the handful of our viewers who actually might have one of these folks working on a project, you know that. So our topics today are, we're going to do kind of three segments. The first is our usual kind of news of the week. And the second is we're going to talk about the kind of technical great benefits we get from using monorepos at a kind of small to medium project scale. And then for our third segment, we're going to get to, I guess, the challenges part from our title here. We're going to talk about the challenges and how to get past the challenges when your monorepo spreads past one team and you start to get multi-team, multi-manager, multi-chain of reporting conflicts can start to come in. And so that'll probably be the juiciest part. So I encourage everybody to keep watching so you get to the best part when it arrives. So I guess news of the week. Paul, I think you said you had one news of the week item.
Well, yeah, we got like the world of online editors keeps charging forward. The race there seems to be picking up. We had StackBlitz announce NX support this week. So right on topic as well for the broader conversation.
I'm so looking forward to teaching our class with that.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to get in there and see if we can't take our bespoke process where we take our NX teaching content and rather than trying to split that out and tease that out into taking our NX monorepo and turning it into an actual multi-repo for the sake of publishing.
Yeah.
Being able to just do away with all of that and just say, nope, you can load the whole thing in StackBlitz. That's going to be a great day.
It looks like it's still a little bit inconvenient. Like as part of the configuration process for putting an NX on a StackBlitz, you still have to pick like a project which will get launched by default. But we're going to see if we can come up with some kind of menuing or something, some way to make it easy for somebody to just click the example they want to see. I would imagine most people who are planning on using an NX monorepo in a StackBlitz probably don't have 150 projects in their monorepo, but we are going to try it.
Yeah.
Other news of the week. I got a thing. I'm excited about those new MacBook Pros.
Yeah.
I've not ordered one yet. I'm planning on being quite patient because my current MacBook Pro is fine and like don't really travel much at the moment. So it's hard to get super motivated to go through the upgrade misery on the spot. But I don't know, maybe in a few months when all the reviewers have figured out which ones are better and worse and all the OS and other tool upgrading is done, they're awful tempting. Kind of wish that. Go ahead.
Now might be the time for me to jump into Mac finally.
Yeah, the only challenge is that I don't know if it's the projects we support seem to be spread across OSs. So we do have some customer work where we're kind of Mac is the native development platform, but there are still quite a few that have Windows as the native platform. And if you're running that today, you're talking about emulating x86 on your non-x86 Mac chip.
Yeah.
It's working for me.
Yeah.
I've got Parallels and a Windows 10 VM, Windows 11 VM actually. And so I managed to get a customer project running that was using Java and Craft and a bunch of running the backend services and all that jazz, and managed to get it running from a VM.
Have you seen any benchmarks? That's the thing I'm curious about, how it benchmarks.
No, I don't know.
Yeah.
I did manage to just do it for the back end, and then I wasn't comfortable actually writing code in it, so I've got the proxy config. So
yeah,
I have it pulled down, the web app pulled down on the Mac side, and it's hitting the back end on the Windows VM. So,
just to be clear, I'm perfectly happy with the functionality of my Windows laptops. The one feature of the MacBook that's drawing me to it is the fact that I can use it for more than 2 hours without having to go chase down a power plug.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the benchmark I'm looking for is if you have to run a Windows VM for something, how much of the long battery life do you end up giving up, sacrificing to the VM layer? That's
Yeah.
the part that's why I'm saying I'm interested and excited about these new machines, but I'm not like place an order right now. It's like a bunch of very deep reviewers are gonna find out about all this stuff for us soon.
I have the VM running like pretty much all the time. It doesn't really.
Aren't you plugged in though?
I mean, even when I'm not, like I have a tendency to go down for a snack and never come back up. So
That happens.
I didn't work in the kitchen a lot. So.
Trying to think any other news of the week in our world. Oh, I guess this is news of last week also. That exciting new Google Pixel 6. I've been using a Pixel 5 for the last year. I'm sort of kind of going back and forth. I'm pretty happy with the Pixel 5. I don't know if I'll get the 6. Any other Pixel users in our crowd here?
The 4A 5G right here. I'm not looking to jump anytime soon. It's good enough for me for now.
Yeah, it's kind of and the Pixel 5 is like almost like I think it's like not quite as high end a phone as the 4 is. And like so I have this like very non-high end Pixel 5 and it just works so well. It's hard to get motivated to carry a slightly bigger phone.
Yeah.
I
I
will
just
say-
got the automatic update to Angular 12 this week
Android 12.
Oh, sorry, thank you. Android 12. Angular
Me too.
13's tomorrow, different thing. But and so like the way that it shows the time on the logout or login page is a little different, but other than that it's not a huge deal. But the fact that I'm still getting those automatic updates for Android pushed means I'll stick with this. But at some point this will get end of life, and then the Pixel 18 or whatever the number will be at that point will be very attractive.
I am not in love with the new material design.
And
Changes.
it's
It is
too big and
it
too
is-
roundy, but I can
Yes.
deal with it.
Material U, I think is what they call
Is
it.
that what they're calling it?
Material
That's-
U.
Maybe it's them. It ain't me.
Yeah, I've noticed it seems like stuff is. I mean, it's kind of good that they made some things that were small a little bigger, but I kind of feel like they went too far. And now some of the stuff is so big, you wish it was a little smaller so you could fit more of it on the screen. Maybe next time there'll be like a material Wii, and there'll be like a little slide control. You just be able to say, make everything a little bigger or a little smaller, or just like a zoom gesture.
This is clearly all part of the arms race for bigger phone screen sizes.
There you go. So
You got bigger controls. Now we need bigger screen to fit more controls.
yeah,
And they'll bump up the size again.
and like
And
when
then they're going to like Android 37 is going to release exclusively on phones that are actually just computers.
I switched back to the smaller size, relative to a hand-sized phone, and it has been so nice to have an easily carried phone compared to my older one that was significantly bigger.
Yeah, my metric is basically if it can't fit in my pocket, I don't really want it as a phone. So
Yeah. Okay, any other tech news of the week before we get into our good stuff? Lance, did you say there's a new Angular version also?
Yeah, I just saw tweets from Eager. They're planning Angular 13 to come out tomorrow.
Oh, great. I admit I have not been following whatever the new hotness is going to be.
Yeah, I will post the link.
Any big changes in it?
I've just seen the tweet. I haven't followed it. Let's see. Eager says it'll ship with the most modern version of the Angular package format. So ES modules, things like that are going to be changing, mostly affecting library developers. I'm not sure what else.
I mean, the change I'm looking forward to is when eventually we no longer have to do that like recompile process that it does.
Well, it does
'Cause
say,
that's just painful.
yeah, it does say Vue Engine and NGCC are no more, but
They're
Yeah,
wow,
Vue Engine's gone.
that's great.
so we'll
That
see
is
how
great.
Yeah, we'll find out.
Okay, yeah, I mean NGCC is the thing that runs that you have to is the thing that is executing when we're like, this is one of those things where I mean we're of course pretty familiar with Angular here for our occasional viewers. So we're very familiar with the payoffs of Angular, but for somebody who's at the point of like trying to choose, it's really hard to argue for tool A if they're choosing tools B and C, and A has this long delay and B and C don't. And like kind of regardless of what the story is of how it came to be, just like as a snapshot point in time, it's not a good look. And I'm really thrilled that they're finally fixing that.
Is there a Basil package under Angular? Because I'm looking
Yes.
at the changelog and
There is.
Yeah, okay. I didn't realize that.
So the Basil stuff is used to be kind of all over in the Basil world, and it's now sort of oozing out, where Basil support is now shipping with many things, which is pretty great. Pretty great. Actually,
Now-
that ties into monorepo stuff. Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say the real news from all of the Angular update is they're dropping support for IE 11.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. They deprecated it in 12.
So I feel like most libraries already didn't support IE 11, and so I think it's a pretty small percentage of users who are on Angular but not using any libraries. I mean, there are some, but I mean, most projects that we see in the wild at Giant Corps are using many libraries. So I don't know. I'm glad they're finally ripping the Band-Aid off, Paul, but I kind of feel like a lot of companies have already dropped that support. Well, I guess we should go to our first main topic, monorepos. Kind of the technical side of monorepoing within a project instead of having a bunch of little repos. Anybody want to describe the basic idea here for the viewer who maybe has only been using Angular CLI or maybe has 5 different repos for their 5 different related projects?
I mean, I guess at a basic level, it's like instead of having a very spread out approach to your development and having like different projects and different repos, it's just cramming all of that into one repo and actually having like good reusable code shared across all of them. At least in my case, project I've worked on, like code reusability is a huge part of that process. I mean,
Yeah,
monorepo.
Zachary and I worked with a client a few years ago where there were essentially 2 libraries we worked on, and well, one app and one library, and that library was only used by that app. They had a vision that it would be used by other apps, and it never actually happened. But they really should have just been together in one repo so we could have shared things. But because they had been created as separate repos, we had to do a lot of work of every time I made a change in the library repo, I had to publish something and then wait for that finished and then update the package JSON of the app in order to point to the latest version from Artifactory and all that. And it was this big dance that if they had just been together in one repo, it would have been easy. And that's probably the easiest, most obvious case where we should have had a monorepo because it was the same team doing things together. We will get into more complicated situations later in our conversation. But that was like the most obvious case of why did we have to run through these hoops of putting something in Artifactory so that I could use what I just rewrote.
Yeah, I mean, to me, when I'm talking to people that are, kind of thinking about that first tiny bit of adoption, stepping from I have 2 repos for 2 very closely related projects to combining those into one, I talk about being able to make an atomic commit that spans both, say, let's say you have 2 applications in one library they share. If they're versioned separately, then you have this process to go through. Well, I have to create a backward compatible version of the core library. Then I have to publish it. And then I have to upgrade both things that use it. And that doesn't sound too bad, but it's extra steps. And if you repeat that at scale, you're spending a lot of money managing versions. If you decide instead to say this group of code can be versioned as a single unit and make atomic commits across it, that can translate directly into not spending money on that and getting some better features or bug fixes instead. I think that's the most compelling small scale pitch. I mean, it's a different world when we're talking about organization-wide monorepos, but for just that first step, I've had good luck with that argument. Paul, I know you're in the middle. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a nuanced argument I try to make, especially in the Angular for Architects class, where I try to get folks to see how taking a library first approach to their application design typically results in just an all-around better architecture for the system as a whole. Like, you just end up writing better code if you have the tools that enable, encourage, and support the decomposition into smaller units.
I put that URL on the screen for anyone that sees this and wants the Angular for Architects class Paul just mentioned. Shout out to. So, library first development. I've heard a lot of something first development over the years. A lot. What's library first development in a little more detail?
It's really just more of a thing I made up out of an observation. It might be a formal thing elsewhere. If it is, I apologize. I'm not trying to steal or describe that thing incorrectly. This is just what I call it. It is the idea that when you're within a monorepo and you have tools that support multiple libraries, if instead of trying to say, okay, what's the next feature I need to add to my app, and what steps do I need to add it to my app, instead start with, okay, what layer of decomposition does this feature need to live at? How far removed can and should I make this next feature from the core system? Can I make this a shared library? Is this beneficial to not just my team, but other teams? Is it beneficial to other projects on my team? At what layer is it appropriate for this code to live? And the further out you tend to push those libraries, the better and cleaner the interfaces and interactions with it tend to be. And so typically speaking, the simpler it becomes, even if it is more generic. It is free from the entanglements and the spaghetti code tendencies that you don't even realize you have when you're building it alongside the complexities of the business logic of your primary first use case of an application.
I feel like this is kind of this is a modern take, a modern update on the kind of traditional, like the best advice. It's been true since the 70s, I think, maybe the 60s. Good code. It's modular, which means high cohesion and low coupling. And I think that library first idea takes that and like kind of sets it in today's technologies and toolings a lot better than just the generic advice does.
Yeah, and I would say the unique spin that this situation has is that the tooling of the monorepo framework is helping to enable this at yet another degree of separation.
So as long as we're plugging tooling, I will plug that at scale, which is not what we're talking about today. Building complex things at scale in a gigantic organization-wide monorepo is almost dominated by Basil, which we do some consulting work in. But what we're talking about today are tools that are tremendously easier to adopt than Basil. And so somebody want to give a little shout out to our favorite kind of JavaScript-centric monorepo tooling kit?
I assume you're talking about NX.
We love it. It is so easy. NX is so easy. Every time I work on something in Basil, I'm reminded that Basil is so powerful at scale, and NX is so ergonomic to get started.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say one thing, about the library first development. Because, like, in traditional, I come from the Java background. There's always talk about separating your application into layers, like, the data layer, the service layer, the whatever layer. And then we also have this other approach, in the Angular and stuff, where it's like, okay, we need to separate everything out by feature. And with the kind of library architecture that, NX is promoting, you get both of that at the same time, because you're separating your libraries out into kind of traditional layer types like service layer, data layer, and then also separating them across feature. And so you're kind of getting the best of both of those things. And as Paul pointed out, the tooling actually enforces those rules for you, which I haven't seen before in anything else.
Yeah, an example of that is a project I was on where they brought us in because they were having some decoupling issues or trouble with decoupling. And we recommended that they bring in NX in order to be able to separate those things. But the code as they had it showed the older Angular style, like the really old recommendation that you have a components directory and a directives directory and all of these things together. And what ended up happening is that their components really had no scope control to them. They're like an individual component would be doing everything. Like, this component will be showing something on the UI and changing the title for the browser tab and making calls directly to the backend and everything like that. And just one of the steps of trying to figure out the decomposition was going through component by component, saying, okay, should this component be a UI component or or util the services, or or a feature, or what should it be? And often it was difficult to decide because these components hadn't had their scope constrained. And a point that I made during that conversation was that NX by itself would not have allowed us to get into this uncomfortable situation before. Now, allowed is a little bit of an exaggeration, because you still can, but there are actual things in the tooling to kind of push you away from it that are putting up flags to say you're going off what you should. You can ignore all those flags, but at least those flags are there. And with just the style of development that this client had, they didn't have any of those flags, and so they just had decoupled code everywhere.
So,
coupled code everywhere.
So a long time ago, I worked on a sprawling Java source code base. Many, thousands and thousands of files. Although now that I mention it, I've heard of Java projects that have hundreds of thousands of files, and I think this might have been under 100. But many thousands of files, tens of thousands of files, thousands of Java packages. And at the time, we found that we had uncontrolled accidental dependencies. And so we developed on this project level ad hoc tooling. We found a tool that would take the results of compiling, and I think it had to trigger some feature on the compiler. We were able to generate a text file that had a list of all the package level dependencies. And then we were able to write rules about allowable package level dependencies, kind of an allowed list of what both concrete or what pattern, this.star.this can depend on this.star.this. And then trigger a build failure if a change broke the list of allowed package level dependencies. And as I think back, that was a great piece of tooling way back then. I'm probably talking about 15 years ago. But you can achieve most of that out of the box without having to have somebody on your project who can go create ad hoc, special, crafted tooling for your project. And that's what I see as a really big benefit of the kind of growing wave of monorepo adoption, is that the tools that you need to manage dependencies better are moving out of that domain of you have to have one of these weird folk who go and create that kind of tooling to, the tooling is in the box, it's standardized, everyone knows how to use it, let's just go turn it on and use it. I think that's such a big benefit.
Another benefit of the whole library separation, like even if you have just one application in your monorepo but broken into libraries, I've had a situation where one Angular application was so large, it's being worked on by 10 teams of many developers, and so not only for the purpose of getting good architecture, good code structure, but also splitting up into libraries helped with having teams not trampling each other, because each team is really responsible for a separate portion of the app. So having it well separated by both feature and layer in the libraries allows you to, have less conflict between different teams working on different parts of the application.
I think that kind of falls into the path of monorepos as a whole, but NX and Basil both have this, because it's kind of just a natural thing that occurs. It's just dependency mapping, and that brings to the forefront so much good stuff in terms of I can say I edited this one small code. I only need to test this app, or unit test this one small feature. And that brings into foreplay so many good things with CI/CD, just everything. That's kind of a nice benefit of just globbing all of your code together and then creating a dependency map.
Okay, so to take a step closer to the organizational challenges once your monorepo spans teams, we're not quite there yet, but an advantage of a monorepo can be, this is a policy thing, not an absolute, but it can be, many teams when they go with a monorepo, they also adopt or are coaxed into a single version policy for their dependencies. Okay, so for example, on the ancient Java project I was speaking of, we had a bunch of different kind of deliverables, and some common libraries and a bunch of dependency management. But we also had a single list of the jar dependencies and only a single version of each one. And each library could depend on a subset of those, of course. But whatever of the many libraries we're using, we were only using a single version of each library, which meant that when two different parts of the system had to talk to each other, they wouldn't hit a library version mismatch. And when you had to upgrade, you were upgrading everything. So I did that ad hoc 20 years ago in Java, as many of us in the industry then did. But it was ad hoc. It was like, oh, that's a crazy idea. Let's have a single version across multiple projects. Something that you get by default with NX that we've been talking about in the JavaScript world, and you also kind of get by default to a certain extent with the kind of the scaled monorepo tooling, is this defaulting toward a single version policy for your dependencies. So a single version of your library and a single version of any third-party dependencies you're bringing in. Now, let's say the 5 of us were working on a project together, that would mean that maybe we're delivering 3 different related Angular programs and they have 5 different shared libraries. And maybe got a React program too. And in the React thing, we're also using RxJS. And there's a single version of RxJS across all of those things so that this piece of code is always going to be compatible with this piece of code. That sounds like a great benefit. Now we're going to talk in a few minutes how that we can have issues around that. But before we get to the issues that come up, has anybody had any like really positives from that single version? Have you seen as you've helped a project move to a monorepo?
I mean, they're so subtle. That's one of those benefits that you don't even realize you're benefiting from. It's just one of those where it's just not a thing I think about from day to day. Is the challenges I would have had if project A and B were on 2 different versions of Angular, and I had to keep updating my library to be like backwards compatible across both, or something ridiculous like that, and maintaining multiple versions of my library because of multiple Angular. Like that's just not a problem you think about. So the success is just in the, oh yeah, you're right, that I don't worry about that every day.
So it seems like this one is taking us straight into the multi-team issue. Do we have any other sunshine and rainbows, single team and monorepo adoption tips we want to share before we jump into the mud?
I like the build time benefits.
Yeah.
That a lot of folks take for granted. The ability to use the Zachary pointed it out, like the holistic understanding of your dependencies.
Build graph.
And the build graph that you can get from that, and the tools that you can then go on to stack on top of that NX in this case has, such as their caching services. And then furthermore, the testing, being able to test only those pieces that have changed. It isn't just this is kind of nice, like it also affects the CI/CD runtime of each build that you want to crank out. So that's just a kind of a nice little sidecar benefit of the platform.
So at scale, Basil keeps the build graph in memory and lets you run fairly complex queries against it. And a shout out to our NX developer friends who are in the process of adding, I think it's opt-in right now, keeping NX resident so that it can keep the build graph in memory. It's quite beneficial to do that, to avoid having to recalculate the build graph on every time a command is executed. Well, it seems like
Yeah.
we might be ready to jump in the mud here. Hope you say something, Lance?
I was just going to say that affected is a really nice feature.
Yeah.
It also say make sure to use your tags to help define what your groupings are. You can use the tags for experimental and stable, although I've never actually gotten to that point. You can do tags for your UI util things. You can do tags for this app and this app, and these are shared, so you can have the linter enforcing your separation of concerns for you, which is a feature that is annoying when you don't realize what great things it is doing for you.
I want to make one more point on the tagging. If you have a repo that has a mix of application types like React, Angular, or Node apps, it's really helpful to tag libraries with tags related, so you can identify, well, this library is okay to use in a Node app versus an Angular app, or both. Because I had one project where I didn't realize I was actually indirectly importing Angular into my Node app because I had like one thing in a service or something. So I had to restructure my libraries a little bit, but I caught that much later than I would have liked because I wasn't tagging my libraries that way.
Yeah, being able to say this node executable is not allowed to even indirectly depend on this front end library is really nice.
Yeah.
Kind of helps you get that stuff right, hopefully before it gets merged instead of after. Okay, well, I think I'm gonna lob a bomb out there, and Paul is gonna pick it and help us navigate the difficulty. So instead of my monorepo being just on my team of me and my 15 best buddies who collaborate really well, keep up to date with each other, now we have a monorepo, and it spans 2 teams. A team working on a design system and a team working on an application. The design system's pretty good shape, but there's no budget this quarter to really do any work on the design system because it's in good shape. And now I need to upgrade my monorepo from Angular 11 to 12 or React 16 to 17. And that design system code is going to need some updates. So now I've got a cross-team issue in my first scenario here. I got a cross-team issue. Team A wants to make a change to the stuff that's shared in the monorepo, like the list of dependencies. Team B is not necessarily opposed to it, but just doesn't have budget to do it right now in their organization. Help.
Well, I'm going to tease for a second and say that was awfully presumptuous of you to assume that you got approval to do a monorepo in that scenario in the first place.
Yeah?
That the clients even said that, oh, hey, this sounds like a good idea and we should do this.
Yeah, so let's take it back a step. Let's say that a company is, or maybe a branch of a company is considering a monorepo that's going to span 2 applications plus a design system implementation. So before we even get to the situation I described, what do we talk them through? Because this is the real thing. Like we have gotten this question. We at least Paul on this call, and I think other people not on this call, have been asked to show up at a meeting to help a division of a big company make it through this question. So what is the advice? What do we do? Should we even be? We're considering doing a monorepo for these handful of projects and this design system that they share. Paul, should we do this? What's going to bite us?
Yeah, the overwhelming majority of the things that I focus on in those conversations is political and organizational.
Sure.
You know, it's like we were just describing, we were kind of setting up this story, but we were really kind of dancing around it. And that is like, well, what is fundamentally the difference between all the benefits on these small projects that we were talking about at the beginning that center around one team going to 2? Like, what is it about going to 2 in the first place that creates angst or consternation around using a monorepo tool stack? And the overwhelming concerns that I hear are around the ideas of, well, we have different deployment cycles, we have different deployment processes, we have different schedules that we want to release on. And the common understanding around that is if I'm on a monorepo, I can't do that. Like if I release one, I have to release them all. And that's a bit of a misconception tied in there with it. But that's usually where the conversation needs to start, is with what are you building? What apps are you trying to produce from this system? And how does your organization exist today to support those being shipped? So that's kind of where the conversation starts. You can go any number of places from there.
Oh, go ahead.
I have a question that I've gotten that I don't actually have the answer to, so I'm throwing it out there. I was trying to sell somebody on an X, and their response was that they only want certain people touching certain things. So if you have everything in a monorepo, can you control access at a more granular level? And I don't think you can. I mean, well, there's two things, right? There's controlling access to a level that I can't even see it, which doesn't seem possible. But then there's, can you control who can actually commit to a particular portion of the repo?
So I've been with one of my clients, we ran into both parts of that. And one of the times it ended up meaning that we couldn't even consider a monorepo because there were IP issues around, and we were a favored client working on one app, and we wanted to combine with another app that was being worked on by a non-favored client. And if we had combined, they would have had access to see our code, and for IP legal reasons, that wasn't allowed. So a monorepo
you're
wasn't.
dealing with like regulations around an acquisition of companies, even, right?
Yeah, so that was like, if it comes down to we need to prevent people from seeing the code, I don't know of any way of doing that. However, I'm pretty sure that on the second level, if it's just, I want to protect this slice of it so that only these 7 people are allowed to commit to this part of the repo. I believe tooling's in place with that with Bitbucket and other things, but I haven't actually used that. So it depends which of those two concerns you'd have.
So I can give an answer for part of that. If you're using Git, if you're not using Git, many of the older source control tools actually have like directory level permissioning systems. I used to use Subversion extensively in the good bad old days, and had a very elaborate configuration mechanism. But Git by default, so Git does not have a built-in mechanism, but the single most popular place to host your Git, which is on GitHub, does. So GitHub has this code owners mechanism, and you can mark, so if this directory and its subdirectories need one of these people to sign off on a PR to make a change that goes in, that affects this directory. And I think some of the other ones have something comparable. If anybody's used something more concretely, please say so. Like, does the Microsoft one have something? I think it might.
I think it might. I know in previous projects we've had something similar, and we just had like a glob of developers that were approved general, like across the monorepo they could approve code. And it was just kind of like a de facto, like, hey, if something comes, like anyone could edit any of the code on monorepo, which was the nice part. But again, that comes into play like, oh, they're messing with the component library when they're just like a random app developer. Usually that would just bring in like all the required reviewers, and then there'd be a discussion of like who should actually review this section versus other sections. And I don't know if there's anything concrete that we did with Azure, which I think is the Microsoft one. It was just more of like a de facto, like, hey, we have an agreement, and all the reviewers are kind of in communication with each other.
So it sounds like depending on the tools, you might choose either a soft enforcement of which people kind of hold the commit right for a certain subsystem, or you might have a hard enforcement where it has to have a click from a reviewer in a certain list to make a change in a certain section. Does that answer your scenario, Chris?
Yeah. So this seems like, the code owners file in GitHub is kind of the best case scenario there.
Yeah.
Bitbucket also has a plugin that adds the code owners functionality.
Oh, great. I did not know that.
Yep. Yeah, so Chris, jumped right into it. It's that whole question was more about the the organizational politics than it was about any of the code that actually lived inside the repository. So yeah, I typically hear the question of deployment releases, and I usually have to work to first dispel the notion that you are forced to release at the same time every time a change is made, and have to explain some of the mechanics of how the monorepo itself, in any CIC that you place on top of it, does not necessarily require that you produce a new build that gets shipped. But even with that, there's still some truth to the underlying idea, and that is if I have a change that I'm creating in library A, both of my apps use library A. The next time I go to add a new feature to either of those apps, it must roll in those changes to library A. It's like there's no way of blocking downstream work from pushing itself into your application. So there's no way to version the things coming into your app in that monorepo situation. And so that is a particular challenge for some teams.
I mean, to put that differently, though, it's not so much that it's not that that's a defect that someone needs to go fix. That's the point of doing a monorepo, is to have a single version across the whole system.
Yeah, and that statement's at the heart of it. It is that this isn't so much about the monorepo as it is the single version.
Yeah, exactly. If you don't want to have a single version, then your needs are probably being well met by having a bunch of separate repos, but you're probably having a lot of costs related to having version skew. So you can trade off. It's a trade-off, right? You can get rid of version skew, but now you have to deal with the costs of having a single version, which is that when I update the code here, I actually do have to go update all the points of use.
Yeah, I would say, being forced to update everything up front is less of a pain and less expensive than having to do it later as you are upgrading things.
I mean, I think that's the fundamental thesis of the monorepo. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and the follow-up question after you walk folks through that becomes one of, okay, well, let's say I need to make an emergency change to the system. If that system says that my API change that I'm rolling into this monorepo affects these 5 other things, and I have to reconcile that change with 4 unrelated apps that aren't on fire because of some sort of client emergency. Are you trying to tell me that I have to invest the time in making all of those apps work correctly, work right with this change just to deal with this emergency? And they kind of get onto that track next in their thinking.
I mean, my thought on that is, well, if you're planning on doing an emergency deployment of shared service 7, then you're going to need to do that in a backward compatible way, right? Well, yeah. So yeah, just do it in a backward compatible way in the code. I mean, if your emergency makes a breaking change cross apps, then the monorepo is neither creating the problem nor fixing the problem. It's a really bad idea to make an emergency breaking change that breaks some clients of an existing service is not a good idea, regardless of your tech stack.
Yeah, other idea.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, other ideas then shift to management of the system. It's like, okay, well, who's reviewing this? Who's owning this? Who actually becomes kind of the keeper of the keys of quality? Because if you had a problem before about saying, oh, we want to enforce some code practices across the org, and you're moving into a monorepo, now that's really going to be a challenge.
So,
now,
go ahead.
On one hand, I think, me personally, I think it's easier because you now can tool the whole thing in one shot, but you now actually need to like own up and say, oh, I am actually going to enforce this, or I'm not. At that point.
Example of Prettier, for example, if we're going to use Prettier, we're probably going to use Prettier across all of the projects that are in a monorepo, and we're probably going to have one configuration file at the top, and then just everybody's going to live with either semicolons or not.
Yep.
And in terms of code practices, we go into linting, right? And
Yeah.
the choice of that is you can actually make your own custom rules, which you don't have to like make a custom rule for every single one of the applications. You just have one that spans the entire monorepo. It's nice and seamless and automated, right?
I mean, there's nothing to stop you from having a different lint config for different projects in a monorepo, but definitely the monorepo
Have
approach.
good defaults though, right?
Yeah, like it totally pushes your default to let's just have one of this config file for everything.
Right. And then even like in the NX case with schematics, when you generate a new thing, it just gets all the nice defaults of linting and prettier and stuff like that just set up. And then hopefully they don't really need to tweak it much unless they just don't like the defaults. I don't know.
So has anybody heard the quip about a tandem bicycle or a bicycle built for two? That wherever your relationship is going, if you get on a tandem bicycle, it's going to get there faster. Have you heard that quip? I've heard that several times now. I think that might apply to a monorepo. However your team dynamics and company collaboration and cross-team collaboration are going, they're going to go more like that if you get into a monorepo. So if your team and if your cross-team collaboration and planning process is already going very well, it's probably going to go even better if you move into a monorepo.
Boy, that's a hot take for the day.
If you're having squabbles, if you're having really just organizational challenges getting aligned, having to go to like the boss's boss all the time to mediate disputes between adjacent teams, then you're probably going to have to do that even more often if you go to a monorepo. So you think,
while that's a golden nugget, it's unfortunately one I think will have to remain kept to myself when talking to a client.
I mean, unless the client sees this video.
I mean, as long as I'm not the one that has to deliver that to them and inform them, like the reason this monorepo process has gone down the tubes is because your team was going to suck either way. That's not really a.
I mean, I wouldn't say that. I would say more like whatever type of squabbles, like however things were going and whatever the pain points are, since you're going to be able to get through some of the basics faster and smoother with a monorepo, you're going to bring more problems to whatever that bottleneck is, whatever kind of issue ends up being the sticking point. You're probably going to be able to get to that sticking point more often because your tools are going to like the stuff that's not a sticking point is going to run so much more smoothly. You're going to be in that, everybody meet in conference room 7 to have a fight about API versioning again. Is going to happen more often because your project's going faster, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a great spin on it, and that is actually somewhat similar to how I describe it. Of you're going to have some sort of organizational conflict about how these two teams are going to interoperate, and it isn't the monorepo that is adding the complexity. Like a whole premise of one of my presentations once was that it isn't about a monorepo. It isn't about NX. It's about the problems of code sharing, regardless of approach.
Yep.
And the tool that you pick, like you just mentioned, was a great clarifying point. The tool you pick will either accelerate the challenges of code sharing and cause those to occur more quickly or more slowly, depending upon how streamlined that tool is.
Yeah.
So that is a great point. I gave an example similar to what you said about the getting into a room and arguing about API versioning. One that I had given was around releasing and code freezing. If you have different teams that are under different policies about code freezing, what does that even mean if there's a shared library amongst them that needs to change? Does app B, who is frozen, just stay out of date and has a security vulnerability locked in it forever? In a more distributed system, whereas in a monorepo they're forced to take on that new update even if they don't choose to deploy. like does code freezing even mean anything in a monorepo where any change is a change to the same code base? Those kind of questions are going to crop up in a much faster frequency.
I've had the strangest conversations over the years about the phrase code freeze. It's one of those
That's
words.
a whole other episode.
Well, it's no, I think it is relevant here because like this makes it because just this brings that up. It's one of those things where a team, you can have many teams trying to have a conversation and they're being basically divided by using the same words but with different meaning. I think kind of the default I've seen, kind of the mainstream is code freeze means that we have this release branch and we're really super careful about trying not to put anything in this release branch as we try to stabilize running up to some critical date. We only put emergency bug fixes in the branch that we're actually releasing and running on in between November 14 and January 2. Something like that, if you're a big retailer. But then there are other organizations that, I don't want to speak ill, but there are people who like maybe seem to be not aware that branches exist and think code freeze means don't do any coding in any other branches either. And I don't know if that's just like a vestige I'm seeing in the occasional org that maybe it was late to the game adopting source control. And so maybe they were accidentally publishing changes they didn't mean to, but I have found that weird. And I think there are other meanings beside those two. But it's just one of those oddities. Somebody says code freeze, you sort of nod your head. You're agreeing, oh yeah, let's talk about code freeze. You might not be talking about the same thing.
You reminded me of another point. People using branches kind of badly. Like, so, if you're making a branch, for, let's see I've seen places where they have different branch for like per environment, like dev, test, and prod, and they're like actually building from that branch, doing all the testing, then doing some merges into another branch, and then building and deploying from there. And it's like, well, the thing you just built and deployed is not necessarily the thing you tested, and so that's a mess. And so the idea of building the app once, testing it, and then deploying it into whatever environment you need, it is really helpful, because otherwise, you're constantly rebuilding to deploy the new environment, so you're introducing this risk of the changes coming in.
Yeah. I think there's probably somebody somewhere who has a legitimate and important use case for having different branches for different deployment environments, but I think that's not a good default. Chris, as you said, the default should be we build and then we push the exact same build artifacts from one deployment environment to another, so that as we promote, we have confidence we're promoting the thing that we trust from the previous.
Yeah.
Right? We're not promoting a different piece of code that we hope is similar to the one that we just demonstrated works.
I think with Angular, I think that the whole existence of that environment file mechanism has encouraged people down the wrong path.
Yeah.
Doing that sort of thing.
I really like. To me, environment means runtime settings, not build time settings. And I'm a little bit displeased that they grabbed the word environment and used it for that other meaning. The problem is I don't really have an obvious better word they should have used for that other meaning.
Is there, maybe there's something wrong with my thinking, but like I just don't stress about it. Thanks, Lance. I just don't stress about it. Like the notion of I must ship the same build artifacts to each of my things before promoting it. Like, I don't know. I'm perfectly okay relying on a tested mechanism within Angular as I rebuild for my different environments.
Yeah,
and like adding testing around what I do with the environment switching. Like I'm okay building, each of my environments separately and just leveraging that mechanism and not making it a runtime resolved set of variables.
I don't think it's so much as not trusting Angular in the environment file mechanism. It's when people are doing that and building off different branches. So like you tested one set of commits, and then you did a bunch of merging and Git stuff, and your Git's a mess anyway. And then you do another build off of another branch to deploy to the next environment. So that's really the concern, is the messy Git situation, and not necessarily, the thing that the QA testers approved isn't necessarily what you're deploying to production exactly. Not so much the actual mechanism of the environment file, just that encourages people to do multiple builds in some way. But regardless of that, the other thing is still a problem of building off of a different Git history,
Yeah, and I suppose the way I've managed my Git history for projects where I get to actually use the environment feature is also a very different world than folks who create Git graphs that are impossible to actually traverse.
Right. Nobody's Git is as clean as yours, Paul.
That's not true. I know most folks here, when given the opportunity, do the same kind of stuff I do. It's just we're not often afforded that opportunity.
So that's a great point of connection, in that as you move to a monorepo, right? So for the first step, a team has 3 repos for 3 pieces to one team moves to a monorepo. That team is going to have to update and kind of up their game in use of source control, because they'll be using more. Like, it'll matter more. It's all like kind of living in the same place. Okay, and that's like a training, learning, understanding, team alignment issue. But going back to what happens as soon as you have cross-team sharing of a monorepo, all of a sudden you're probably going to be having meetings to try to reconcile across teams. How do we as a broader organization use source control? What is our merge strategy? What is our review strategy? Do we do drive-by reviews post-merge? Do we do gating reviews pre-merge? Do we do squash merges? Do we rebase, or do we keep a longer history? Do we allow fine-grained commits? Do we require coarser commits? All of these things can. I mean, I have seen these kinds of questions generate cross-team tension when different teams maybe were completely aligned on what the endpoint should be, but might just have different cultures on how they use the source control system. Certainly, I don't want to say anything about any specific client of ours, because we've helped quite a lot of them with this kind of thing over the years. But if anybody can have some broad lessons that we've learned helping our customers with this, I think it would be great for any viewers here.
Well, I was just thinking of, before Chris and I joined this company, we were at a previous client where we were the Angular team, and we were committing to the same repo as a bunch of Java developers, and which is funny because we were former Java developers ourselves. But Chris and I have worked together for 15, 20 years by now, so we were really comfortable with each other code, and so we did post merge commits, and no one else knew how to deal with that. They really wanted to do more of a PR style pre-merge commits, which is
in reviews, post-merge reviews.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I meant. That makes much more sense than what I said. So we were doing post-merge reviews, and we were okay with that. And it just trying to figure out a system for them to work that would handle both the approach that the rest of them dealt with and what Chris and I wanted took a while. It's funny now that, all my work I do PRs, and so I've switched to the other approach. But yeah, Chris and I created that problem for the team we were on.
But that was also, that wasn't Git, it was Perforce, and so doing like a PR just wasn't a thing.
Yeah.
So there's a unique aspect that I point out when advising on making this shift, and it is that ideally, within your organization, the goal of every commit within every project would be to move the company forward by way of moving their systems forward as a whole. In practice, what that looks like is developers are typically only considering how to move the project within their repo forward, without concern to how that improves the systems that they're being built as a whole forward. Whenever you're in a monorepo, it kind of enforces that every commit be improving the systems of the organization as a whole forward. So there's a brand new level of quality that is expected in every commit from every developer that the majority of the developers have never even experienced before. That can be quite the culture shock within a company. And this is the committing aspect to it is actually just one aspect. Like, it's not just in how you manage your Git tree. While that is true and that is an aspect of it, and you're either going to improve the quality of your source control history over time as an organization or degrade it, depending on how you're managing that. The same is true for your code base as a whole now. Like, if you're not enforcing the company-wide policy of, how we use Prettier, for example, on one project, it felt as though that we're isolated. Oh, that's just that one group off on the side. Like, we don't really care what they do. But whenever they're in the monorepo, it makes it real obvious, real fast that, oh, maybe we should. And now we have to. And forcing that group to now comply with policies that they haven't been in the past, that's going to create a lot of tension real fast within the organization.
Do we have any tips to help with that tension?
Yeah, I was going to say the number one piece of advice I give on this topic is you've got to have an advocate for this monorepo approach placed on every single team. That person should be a member of, should live in both worlds. They should be advocating for the needs and the desires of the team that they're placed on back to the core group of people who are managing the monorepo as a whole. And then they should also be educating the individual team on the policies and the reasons why we're doing the things that we do with the monorepo and how to be a good citizen in that larger monorepo world. You need an ambassador for each team. If you don't, there is nothing anyone can do for you. You've got a team of people who don't know and don't necessarily want to participate in the scheme, yet have to. You're going to have garbage in, garbage out.
So I feel like, as consultants typically brought in to help organizations move forward along various axes, we often find ourselves being in that ambassador role, which is challenging as an outsider. Now, there are benefits to doing it as an outsider also, but it can be challenging as an outsider because we're typically brought in to try to help, not to tell people what to do. We're typically there to coach, not to boss.
So there is like a fine line between that, though, in terms of bossing versus coaching, because at a certain point you just have to come up with your policies and you have to enforce them, and that is more of a bossing approach than a coaching approach. Especially with PRs, it's just like if you have your CI/CD set up, if they don't pass the CI/CD, their PR doesn't get in. It's as simple as that. But you need to be able to coach them from, all right, I have my PR, coach them all the way across the finish line, maybe the first couple of times, so that they know what's expected of them, and they're not just stuck in this drudge of like, oh, I have to please the CI/CD gods and make sure my PR actually passes, right?
So you're talking about, let's say the cross team, a division of an organization gets together and decides that we're going to use Prettier. We're going to put it in no semicolon mode, just because that's a pretty hot take mode to put it in. And we're going to set it to a tab width of 3 spaces. And sort of the managers of 5 different teams in a division get together. They all agree to that on behalf of all the developers in their groups. And then the group that operates the CI/CD enforces the rule that any files that are touched by a PR have to be made to follow that, or any better yet, maybe they get the fine-grained stuff you can do if you really polish your CI/CD. Any lines that are touched have to follow the new policy, even if some old lines don't have to. That's the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
And so how do you get past we're just making these edits to appease the CI/CD, and then get to we are jointly using the CI/CD to collaborate and further our organization's goals? Like what is somebody's journey from one to the other?
At least in my past projects, I feel like it's always a bit of a shock at first, because they'll go on, like they'll make a PR, which they might have been doing like all the way before these policies were in place. And now all of a sudden there's just like 1,000 different comments from like automation or whatever that they now have to sift through. And it comes a case where maybe like you just create your own branch based off their PR, show them how to tweak things, show them like the better practices you could do, and then hand that to them and be like, all right, you can use this going forward when you make your future PRs, and it shouldn't be as much as a rough point in the future. It's kind of just like a learning mechanism almost.
Yeah, someone raise the stakes again on the difficulty level. So that scenario that Zachary just described, the next challenge in picking up a monorepo is that the person who's been pushing these commits that he just described that have been getting merged without complaint forever,
Sure.
now suddenly find this wall in front of them. They're trying to get this commit in on a Friday night, and an hour ago their boss left for the day telling them that if this feature isn't in by Monday, you're fired. And
no one's available to do the PR.
No one's available to do the PR and help them on it. And they do not know, they could not care less about what a monorepo is. All they know is that it is, at this moment, their mortal enemy.
Yeah.
And their boss also has no idea that they're even working in a monorepo. They just know that they're responsible for delivering value to stakeholders by way of whipping the dev team forward. And that is a very real situation that crops up to put weird business stressors on holding the line on we have a healthy monorepo.
Yeah, so once you're sharing your monorepo, therefore sharing your CI/CD across teams, right? Then something that used to be a single team problem of I need to get maybe a developer on this team and then a DevOps person on this team, and I need to make sure they collaborate to get this urgent change in. Now means I might need 2 or 3 people across teams, spread all the way across the division, might have to collaborate late on a Friday afternoon to get this emergency change in. And that, I think that is sort of like, that is a cost of working together at bigger scale, is that your collaborations start to become stretched further across an organization. I think a mature organization has a plan to have somebody on duty to help shepherd that change across the line if it really is urgent.
Well, and I was more calling out the choice to use a monorepo has now crept up the reporting chain in terms of where problems are introduced. Like not so much about of course you got to collaborate now. It is that now stakeholders and BAs and folks that are at that level of management and project management that aren't responsible for code, they must also be bought in and on board, or at the very least understand the constraints introduced by being in a monorepo if you're going to have your team working effectively.
Otherwise, everything just becomes blockers, right?
Yeah, everything looks like a blocker to folks that aren't in the code. They just want to know what can we do to remove this impediment, not how can we reorganize to
right, exactly.
to actually be more cohesive as a team. It's kind of weird. Monorepos almost fly directly in the face of Agile. There, I said it.
That is a hot take.
Now, they're certainly not waterfall, but the idea that we're going to have a Scrum Master whose job it is to understand impediments, understand the flow of work, chunk that up into small, isolated units that you can push across the finish line at will, and not have to care about the rest, how that integrates with the rest of the world. That's some integration team's job later on in the release train. Like that world don't work here.
Sorry about that. I had a home disruption.
So that is a challenge. It's not to say you can't. It's just you need everyone who is responsible for that organization. Like, this is not a code level decision. If you're trying to make this as a code level decision, you are likely not going to succeed in picking up a monorepo.
I think I can rescue the anti-agile hot take, Paul. Here's my attempt.
I don't feel you need to be rescued. I'll stand here.
So Agile is about, among other things, empowering teams to keep updating their process, their tools, to deliver what their team is responsible for delivering. As you go to monorepo, you start having to reconcile that across teams. I think that the kinds of issues that come up when a monorepo starts crossing teams are analogous to what happens when you try to do scaled Agile, which our good buddies at our sister company XPM do all the time. Plug. When you try to do scaled Agile and you try to collaborate multiple Agile teams somehow being Agile together, which starts to feel maybe a little bit less Agile than it did when they were doing it separately. So I guess I'm saying there's an analogy between the trade-offs of maybe being slightly less Agile as you go to a multi-team monorepo, with you're going to be slightly less Agile when you're doing Agile across 1,000 developers spread across 10 teams.
Yeah, that's fair. But I'd also say, much like that world of Agile, unless all of your different individual Agile teams accept the fact that the product of their work is designed to be rolled up and be a part of something bigger, then the whole process is just going to seem weird and confusing and annoying and disruptive, rather than a necessity of being part of something bigger.
Yeah.
Now we just have that problem in code with a monorepo. And so understanding is just absolutely key. The tools and the commands are weird and different. Those are one-off weird things that you can learn once and you'll be fine. It really is you've got to at least understand. You don't have to buy into the philosophy, but you at least have to actually understand the philosophy to be effective.
So you need cross-team, both technical and organizational alignment.
Or at least a representation of it in every project.
Wow. Man, that's a heavy thing to ask of folks, right? That ends up it's a big step. I mean, I think the net of all this is it is a big step to have your repository cross teams, especially if those teams are not perfectly aligned for any reason. And that's really the adopting of a monorepo tool within a single team, I think, is ultimately pretty minor, just sort of a straight technical improvement that you should just go do.
Right.
And that the real speed bump, the point where you want to have meetings and careful thought and so on, is actually at the cross-team point. Because then you're sort of signing up for, like you said, Paul, probably in an ongoing way, there's going to have to be some group responsible for code quality across the whole monorepo. And there's going to have to be some cross-team collaboration and nominated ambassadors on each team, and people helping shepherd changes through the whole process. And onboarding new developers is going to mean onboarding them to a cross-project monorepo, not just onboarding them to a single project's source code.
Mhm.
I mean, other than the obvious advice of call a company that's done this before, like Oasis Digital, is there any more advice that we can give our viewer who might be facing this today, trying to spread their monorepo, whether it's Basil or Alerna or NX, and they're trying to span it across their 3 projects in their design system team, whatever. Any other, I've kind of been going over an hour here. Any other final comments anybody has to help somebody in that position? I mean, should you do it? Yeah.
I think it does help. Like, documentation is a complete other point, but just being able to write down the policies and like get a confirmation point of like new, especially for onboarding, especially in that case, bringing new developers in, you can say, hey, here's our documentation, here's like our guidebook, our handbook to working in our monorepo, committing code, doing PRs, all this stuff. It would have links to like research, like things you can learn about in terms of tooling or whatever. Goes a very, very long way, as long as they're actually reading the documentation.
So you're saying like document some of the cross-team decisions you made.
Yeah, exactly.
So that you're not rehashing them. You're just like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, we
we
wrote
made
down
this decision
over here.
on this date. This is what we talked about. It's in writing. We got this. Maybe you need to rehash it down the road because requirements have changed or whatever. But at least you have a fine point of like when someone gets on board, like this is why this is this. That's why this is this, and things are all the weirdities and oddities of your monorepo release document.
So things like, I'm going to go with like the simplest example, because these are in theory the easiest to resolve, are things like your prettier, if you're using prettier, your prettier configuration. So if you decided in April 2020 that you're going to use spaces but not tabs, you are going to use semicolons, and you're going to do 4 spaces. You write down that the decision was made, write down why the decision was made, and then hopefully you don't end up having to schedule a meeting to rehash it as every new developer joins any of your teams.
Right, exactly. It kind of helps with the culture shock a little bit of like, here's how our monorepo works. Because they obviously have all their own biases and opinions coming from previous work or whatever. So at least helps lay down like the law of their monorepo, I guess. The tenets of it.
And does that work for harder things or only for simple things like we decided how to use prettier? I mean, does that work for we decided how to do code review?
I've had it work for code reviews. I've had it work for like generic like automated tooling, like individual libs or something inside of a monorepo. Decisions that were made for it, why it's only generic in this sense but not in another sense.
Oh, interesting.
Again, just documenting everything, right, as much as possible about your decisions, as long as you're actually making decisions about the things.
So you're talking about there's a higher need to write down those decisions when they span teams.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
Getting both teams involved, having, if you need to, a meeting on it, right? And then just saying like, all right, this is our decision. We're documenting it. Here are the reasons why we're doing it.
Fantastic.
Everyone's agreeing to it, hopefully. And then just push forward, right?
That's great. That's a.
Yeah, I like the kind of the doom and gloom approach that I kind of take to describing the scenario. I do because I want folks to take serious if this goes bad, it's going to go very bad. And so I want folks to enter into this situation up front, knowing what the worst case scenario can be. And then I typically follow it up with like, start with one team. You don't go from 1 to N, go from 1 to 2.
You mean like
3.
You mean like projects?
Teams.
Oh, you're teams.
Projects, yeah.
So you're saying you have maybe my team and an adjacent team move into a monorepo together.
Right. Like you don't have to solve all the world's problems at once with this. Like the term monorepo is a misnomer.
Yeah.
It is, and maybe you do this in parallel. Maybe you do 2 teams in this monorepo, 2 teams in this other monorepo. And then once those 2 teams hash it out, like it'd be like a merge sort of your team projects if you need to. May the best policy win. Like make a bracket of teams Make a game out of it if you have to. That
Yeah.
documents the process that Zachary described. Like
That's great.
a chronicle of what teams won and what decisions why, to kind of work your way towards whatever degree of monorepo actually makes sense, or multiple monorepos actually make sense. If you go for N, you're going to accidentally miss the fact that your organization was actually shaped in such a way where it should have had 3 monorepos instead of 1.
So if you start
let this
having
evolve organically.
start having the things that most naturally could fit together, start having first those projects, then those teams start moving projects into monorepos, and then gradually agglomerate toward eventually, if it's appropriate, a whole organization or at least a whole division might have a single.
Right. Like there is zero reason to have your C++ driver code in the same monorepo as your JavaScript code base 9 times out of 10. There could very well be some common assets shared amongst them, but not likely. And so taking a step back from just starting off assuming that, you might actually get to a much healthier, natural set of resources. Is that the Peter principle that you? No. The ship your org chart.
Yeah.
What is that?
What's that called?
Conway.
No, Conway's
Conway's
law.
law. Yeah. You ship your org chart. Yeah.
Like
That's true.
Don't accidentally fall victim of the inverse of that. Don't try and break that to the point of you have one repo and you're just shipping a blob out the other side of it. Rediscover what is appropriate for your organization. That's kind of the final parting advice I give on this. You can have all the benefits, but don't force it on groups that doesn't make sense.
Well, I think this has been great. I've picked up a bunch of useful stuff from what you all have had to say here, and of course, and that's having had a bunch of conversations about this over the last 5 years already. So hopefully for our viewers, they've also picked up some useful things here. Yeah, we're over an hour here, so I guess we should wrap it up at this point. I guess I thank everybody for viewing. Thank you all for attending and participating. I guess welcome back everyone in 2 weeks. Please, I guess, like and subscribe. We're obligated to say since our content's on YouTube. And see you on the next one.